Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today I'm going to be doing a full review and full guide for the Two Fronts pack in the game of War Thunder. Now, one thing to point out before we get started is that I am fully aware that the Tiger is a very popular tank, and so for a lot of inexperienced players, this might be their first experience with War Thunder, so this video is going to be a lot more beginner friendly than usual, so if my regular viewers could bear with me, because parts of this will get a little more basic than I usually like to go into. Now, if you do purchase this pack, the very first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that all of the vehicles in this pack are crewed. If you go to the right hand side of the screen, you'll have a drop down menu on the Tigers, and this will show you both the Tigers and the Ostwind, and then you simply select a crew, which should run about 10,000 silver each. Once a crew is trained on a vehicle, you can switch them back and forth between that vehicle and any other vehicle they are trained on basically at will without any penalty. Now, you start with 3 crew slots, and this pack does contain 3 vehicles. However, I would generally recommend picking up the 4th and 5th crew slot. The 4th crew slot costs 10,000 silver, the 5th costs 50,000 silver. However, you only have to pay this once, and there's no penalty for not using them, so even if you don't have any vehicles for those slots right away, it's perfectly fine and it's not really going to punish you for not using it. As you go up the German tech tree, you can use these additional crew slots to add more vehicles to your lineup. These can be things like medium tanks such as the Panther, alternatively tank destroyers like the Jagdpanzer 470, or even light tanks like the Puma to scout enemies and help you get into aircraft faster. This also brings up an interesting point in that this video will mostly focus on realistic battles, although a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about here still applies to arcade battles, so if you are playing that game mode, then this could definitely still help you. Additionally, if you want to use these extra crew slots for things like a BF-109 or an FW-190, those are all good picks to back up a lineup of Tigers and an Ostwind. Throughout this video, I will be running a lineup of a total of 7 vehicles, however I will only be focusing on the 2 Tigers and the Ostwind including in this pack. Of course, the 3 vehicles in this pack are the Tiger West, the Tiger Ost, and the Ostwind Ost. For those that aren't aware, Ost in German simply means east. Alles klar? Since this pack features 2 Tigers, and those are likely what people are really interested in with this pack, we're going to be looking at those first. Also, before we get started, there are some pretty minor differences between the Tiger West and the Tiger Ost. I will be addressing those when we get to the relevant section, but on the whole, they are very similar vehicles in basically every area. The first aspect to look at the Tigers is going to be the mobility. The Tigers have a maximum speed in the forward gears of 45 kph and reverse gears of 8 kph with a total engine horsepower of about 650, moving their 57-ton bulk. Now, on the whole, this is not exactly great, but it's not terrible, especially for a World War II era heavy tank. The Tigers are fast enough and can usually cruise at around 30 kph on most maps, unless you have a lot of hills or other particularly rough terrain. Additionally, while I definitely wouldn't call an 8 kph reverse gear ideal, it is at least pretty standard for most World War II era tanks, as it's not until you start getting into the Cold War and modern vehicles that good reverse gears start to consistently show up. So while this is a bit of a disadvantage, it's also a disadvantage that most of the tanks you fight will also have to deal with. Additionally, the Tiger does have a neutral steer feature, so you can simply spin the tank in place. However, due to the Tiger's relatively high mass, it's not the best at spinning in place with its lower horsepower engine and its lower power to weight ratio. What I would actually recommend if you need to turn quickly is to accelerate forward and then turn, as this will usually get you a little more momentum to swing the tank around a little faster. On the whole, I would characterize the Tiger's mobility as okay. It's not terrible, but it's not great, and certainly with the level of firepower and armor that it has, it's more than acceptable to get the job done, even if it doesn't excel. Moving on to the protection aspect of the Tiger, and many people are likely going to go into a Tiger thinking the tank is basically invincible and you can just drive around the map being fairly oblivious and still getting a large number of kills, but this isn't necessarily the case. As far as the raw armor thickness, it's not terribly impressive on the Tiger. The front of the hull goes up to 800mm, with the sides of the hull going up to around 80mm, and while this seems good on the surface, even a basic Sherman 75 can go through a perfectly flat upper front plate of the Tiger at point blank range. Additionally, you're probably not going to be fighting anywhere near as many short 75s as you are the American 76 and the Soviet 85, both of which can comfortably go through the upper front plate pretty easily from most ranges. Additionally, while the mantlet of the turret is relatively thick and most enemies will struggle to go through it, the cupola on the top of the tank is relatively thin and does consistently fuse armor-piercing high explosive rounds, so that's going to be something you're going to have to watch out for. That That being said, simply looking at external armor doesn't give you the full picture of a vehicle. We have to look at the internal layout as well. The Tiger has 5 crew members that are spaced reasonably far apart. In the main hull of the tank up front, you have a driver and a radio operator, and then in the turret, you have the loader, gunner, and commander. If you're ever curious which crew member in a vehicle is doing which job, you can simply go into the X-ray viewer and simply mouse over that crew member, and it will tell you what role they do in the crew. One other important aspect, and something that a lot of new players very much miss, is the ammunition. The Tiger can carry almost 70 rounds of ammunition, and I'm going to be perfectly honest, even the best players in the world aren't probably firing 70 rounds in a game, much less somebody who is very inexperienced. You're going to want to download this ammunition because it turns out War Thunder actually models your usage of ammunition in real time. So if you only have 5 rounds of ammunition, there will only be 5 rounds of ammunition modeled in your tank. So obviously the less ammo you have, the less likely an ammo explosion is. I'll go into the exact amount of ammo I usually carry into the Tiger later in the video when we're talking about the gun, but it is something that's important to note, and most vehicles in War Thunder you don't want to carry a full ammo loadout. Now at this point in the video, it's probably a good time to mention the difference between the Tiger West and the Tiger Ost. Both of these vehicles have some additional track link put on the upper front plate. This only provides around 10mm of protection plus or minus, so for the vast majority of guns you fight, it really won't matter, especially if you're showing them a perfectly flat upper front plate. Additionally, the Tiger Ost actually has some bundles of wood on the side of the tank. These only provide a few millimeters of protection and can fuse some heat rounds, but mostly are kind of useless. The Tiger West also very obviously has some camouflage on it that can delay the enemy's ability to detect you, or can make it harder for them to see weak points in very certain situations, so it is somewhat useful, although very situational. The Tiger West also features some track links on the forehead of the tank, although these are basically useless as essentially nobody ever shoots there. If I were to rate the two vehicles, I would say the Tiger West is generally the best. The camouflage netting does make it a little harder to spot exactly where the extra track link armor is, so opponents might not realize you have extra track link armor and might shoot it. That could sometimes situationally save you. Additionally, the enemies potentially not noticing you could also be pretty helpful. Conversely, the Tiger Ost, the big bundles of wood on the side do basically nothing. Really, no experienced opponent is going to be shooting the upper side of the Tiger. They're going to be shooting the lower side behind the road wheels, or they're going to be shooting the side of the turret. So essentially, this is a useless upgrade, and the Tiger West, in most cases, is simply going to be the better vehicle. Now, we've gone over some of the raw aspects of the armor, but the real question is, how do you use the armor? The biggest weakness, and the one that basically anybody can exploit no matter how weak their gun is actually your very large muzzle brake. Trying to hit somebody's barrel, especially if they don't have a muzzle brake, can be very hit or miss, but when you do have a large muzzle brake, it'll likely catch the entire shell, and it's very easy to damage the gun in that instance. So when you're not actively aiming for a shot, you should probably try to keep your gun moving at all times so the enemy can't scope this in. Additionally, one weakness that it's hard to hide is going to be your cupola. As I already mentioned, most tanks can pen the cupola, and if they have a powerful APHE round, they can probably knock out all 3 of your turret crew members. Now, because you have 2 crew members in the hull, losing 3 turret crew members won't instantly kill you, but obviously you won't have your gunner, so you can't shoot back, which is a bit of a problem. If you present a perfectly flat front to an enemy, you need to simply assume that any enemy can simply pen the upper front plate, because the upper front plate, at only about 100mm thick, really isn't going to stop that many rounds at this battle rating, and if it's an APHE shell like the American 76 or Soviet 85 commonly uses, it will likely knock out your entire crew. The upper front plate isn't completely without strong points though. The little machine gun turret and the driver's port can both provide some extra protection and overlapping plates that can sometimes block shells. However, if you are perfectly stationary and you're not angled, it is pretty easy to simply put a round through the upper plate of a Tiger. The lower plate seems like it's a weak point on paper, but in practice, if somebody pens it, all they're going to do is knock out your transmission, and your transmission will basically eat all the shrapnel from that shell. So more often than not, if they hit your lower plate, they're simply going to immobilize you, and you can still shoot back, and you should generally win fights if somebody makes that mistake. Weirdly enough, from the back, the Tiger can sometimes absorb hits, because if they hit the engine, this round will usually just get stuck in the engine, but the Tiger also has a stowage bin on the back of its turret that can sometimes screw with fusing and penetration values on shells enough to where they don't actually go through the back of the turret. This isn't consistent in any way, but Tigers can sometimes take direct hits from the back and be largely fine. If an enemy does get a shot on you broadside, however, you need to simply assume that they are going to kill you because the vast majority of opponents can simply shoot center mass and take you out. While there is a weird little lip right between the upper plate and the lower plate on the side that can sometimes catch shells, the vast majority of the times even fairly weak shells can kill you from the side. So with all that knowledge in hand, it might seem like the Tiger is a fairly weak tank, but you would actually be somewhat wrong. The 80mm of side armor the Tiger has allows it to angle fairly considerably without exposing a side weak point like a lot of other tanks struggle with. So angling the upper front plate increases the protection fairly noticeably, and with the extra track armor and also the ball turret and the driver's port, this can create some pretty awkward shots for your opponent, especially if you're able to keep the vehicle moving. And this gets the #1 point of Tiger survivability. If somebody's going to shoot you, don't stop and always try to stay angled. Generally speaking, if you're wondering what is about the amount to angle your armor, if your gun is pointing over the front left or right corner of your hull, then that's probably about the right point to angle. This isn't a foolproof strategy, and a lot of opponents can still kill you while you're doing this, but as long as you're moving to make it an awkward shot and angling your vehicle, you're giving yourself the best odds possible to survive. Additionally, since I already noted that the cupola and the large muzzle brake are noticeable weak points for the Tiger, it's not a bad idea while you're moving and angling to wiggle your turret around a little to at least make these harder shots as well. Additionally, one big mistake a lot of new players make in the Tiger is when they're taking a corner, they simply roll out broadside. Obviously, as we discussed, a broadside shot is the easiest shot for most opponents to take you out from, so this is absolutely a thing you don't want to be doing, because you're going to expose a lot of your tank before you get your barrel around the corner. Instead, what you actually want to do is you want to back off the corner a bit, and then you want to run at the corner at an angle. This way, by the time you come around the corner, you're moving, and the first thing they see is your angled front, and the second thing they see is your heavily angled side. This gives you the best odds possible of surviving a return fire, even from an opponent that is expecting you to come around the corner. The Tiger does also have access to defensive use of smoke grenade launchers, and since German players are somewhat infamous for being some of the worst smoke grenade users in the game, we will go into a short crash course on how to use those. You shouldn't ever use smoke grenades if you can still return fire, because obviously you don't want to blind yourself and keep yourself from shooting at the enemy. You also don't want to pop smoke grenades if you're immobilized, because if the enemy already knows where you are, they can simply zero you in and you basically are dead anyway. Additionally, don't smoke if there are teammates nearby that have guns that can still engage targets around you. If you're immobilized and your gun is knocked out but you have teammates nearby, those teammates can potentially save you, but not if you blind them. Conversely, some good scenarios in which you want to use smoke grenades: if your barrel is knocked out but you can still drive, you can pop smoke grenades and try to drive away to get back to your team or get behind cover so that you can repair. Additionally, if you're executing a flank and you want to drive up behind the enemy, a great way to ensure that you yourself do not get shot in the back is to pop smoke. That way, even if the enemy were to round the corner and see down that alleyway you're moving, they're not going to see you specifically. And of course, if you need to cross a sight line such as a city street and you know the enemies are watching it, smoke can sometimes also be a useful tool there as well. While this segment might sound like I'm trying to say the Tiger has weak armor, it's kind of the opposite. The Tiger has good armor, but the armor isn't so good you can simply sit there in front of enemies, and it's a good habit in the game of War Thunder to assume that if you are perfectly stationary in front of somebody, they can probably find a way to disable you or kill you relatively easily. But the Tiger's armor is very workable, and if you know how to use it, it can be quite effective in a lot of different situations, so on the whole I would characterize it as having fairly good armor. Of course, moving on to the firepower, the big aspect of the Tiger everybody's aware of, the famous 88mm. Now, before we fully get into the 88mm, one small side note is that neither of these Tigers has a roof-mounted machine gun, so they can certainly be more vulnerable to aircraft than a lot of the American tanks around this battle rating that just bolt 50 calibers everywhere. As an interesting note about the 88 itself, the gun is not stabilized in any capacity, at least not technically. However, the Tiger does have fairly good suspension, so at low speeds and especially on level ground, the gun will stay pretty stable. Additionally, if you're going to stop and take a shot, I would highly recommend rolling to a stop and not slamming on brakes. If you simply roll to a stop, the vehicle will remain pretty stable, whereas if you slam on brakes, you will experience a lot of gun bounce. The 88 has 4 main shells, and we're going to start by looking at the armor-piercing ballistic cap shells, because these are the ones you're likely going to be using as your main shells. You have the PZGR and the PZGR 39. Now, on the surface, the 39 does look better because it has more penetration across all aspects. However, the difference in penetration is fairly minor, less than 15 millimeters, and one big thing to note about the PZGR is that it has almost double the explosive filler. Both of these rounds are what's called armor-piercing high explosive rounds, that is to say they will enter the enemy's vehicle and then detonate. The increased explosive filler on the PZGR will result in more consistent one-shots and will sometimes even allow you to kill enemies that you wouldn't have otherwise killed or even damaged with a PZGR 39. Now, APHE shells in general are some of the most powerful shells in the game simply because they combine good penetration with good damage, and these are no exception. Both of these shells also have a ballistic cap, so they have increased performance against angled armor, and on the whole, because of the increased internal damage and the relatively modest penetration difference, I do tend to prefer the PZGR over the PZGR 39 as my main shell, and that's the shell you will see me using throughout the majority of this video. The next shell is your fairly standard high explosive shell. It only pens about 18 millimeters of armor. However, that 18 millimeters of penetration is fairly static, and if you can pen it, this high explosive shell will basically kill any enemy vehicle that it touches. This is especially true if you run into open top vehicles like the American M18 or M36. Hitting them anywhere, even in the tracks, will kill them, so if you know one of these tank destroyers is running around, preemptively loading this high explosive shell is not a bad decision. That being said, I am going to bring up the heat round alongside the HE round because on the whole, the heat round is just going to be worse. While the heat round technically pens 110 millimeters, it only overpressures at about 10 to 15 millimeters, so it's actually worse at overpressure than the high explosive round. On top of that, 110 millimeters is noticeably worse than both of your APHE rounds, so against most armored targets it is actually worse than them, and it also has the lowest shell velocity out of the 4 shells as well, so it's the hardest to aim at a distance and against moving targets. On the whole, I would say the heat round is essentially useless and you probably shouldn't bother with it. Now, the astute viewer would have already figured this out because you can see them at the bottom of the video, but my preferred loadout is 20 PZGR rounds and 4 high explosive rounds. The reason I'm running 4 high explosive rounds is because there are a decent number of open top vehicles at this battle rating, some tank destroyers, some light tanks, and most anti-air, so you will get some usage out of those in certain situations, but for the most part, 20 PZGR rounds should get you through your average game without any problems. Of course, since this is something of a beginner's guide, we're going to be looking at some common enemies that you're likely to fight in a Tiger and how much of a threat they are and where you should aim on them. We're going to kick things off with the Soviet-made T-34-85. The T-34-85 is not the most threatening enemy you're going to fight. On the whole, as far as its armor is concerned, you can mostly just click on the middle of it at most ranges and angles and reasonably expect to secure a kill. The armor can sometimes bounce shells, but only if you catch it at weird angles, and generally if you hit a big flat piece of armor, you're probably going to knock it out even if the piece of armor you hit is heavily angled. As far as the offense of the T-34-85, the Soviet 85, while it can definitely pen you, is not the most reliable pen, especially if you're keeping angled and moving, and on top of that, this gun is somewhat unstabilized, so it's going to be difficult for the tank to bring it to bear on you at a moment's notice. So it's not the most reactive gun either, even though it can definitely knock you out if it enters the crew compartment. Next up, we're going to be looking at the fairly common Soviet IS-1 and 2 tanks. The IS-1 has a fairly weak lower front plate and driver's port, both of which you can easily put a PZGR round through and knock out its entire crew, and notably the transmission is not in the front, so if you hit the driver's port or the lower front plate, you're not going to get stuck in the transmission. Additionally, it does have a fairly prominent cupola that you can shoot just like it can shoot on you. However, the base IS-1 is only rocking the Soviet 85, so it's not the biggest threat in the world, although it can definitely pen you, and the IS-1 is not that difficult of an opponent, all things considered. Its cousin, the IS-2, is however a bit of a different story. The Soviet 122 can comfortably pen you at most angles and distances, so it is a hugely threatening shell, especially given how much internal damage it's going to do if it does pen. On top of that, many versions of the IS-2 have reinforced track armor on the lower front plate, which makes you unable to pen, and also have an increased upper front plate, which makes that a lot bouncier as well. That being said, the IS-2 also has a fairly significant reload and a very large muzzle brake for its main gun, so disabling the gun is always an option, and of course its cupola is still a weak point that will knock out its entire turret crew. Moving on to the basic American tank, the Sherman. Most American Shermans you're going to run into are at least going to be rocking the 76mm gun, and the biggest issue with the Sherman is not going to be its armor. The armor armor of the Sherman, while it can in rare cases bounce a Tiger shell, especially around the mantlet, on the whole you can just click on the middle of them and reasonably expect to take them out. However, the big issue you're going to run into is actually the gun. While the American 76 might not seem like much on paper, it does have a short stabilizer, so up to about 20 kph it is perfectly stable, and one coming to a stop it levels out very quickly. In addition to this, the Americans also have powered turret drives, so they can actually rotate the gun fairly quickly to get on target, and these make the American guns incredibly good at snapshotting your weak points. So while fighting Soviet tanks with unstabilized guns, it might not be as important to keep moving and angled at all times. Against American tanks, it definitely is. They will definitely hit you if you make a mistake in this area. Another common vehicle you're going to see is the American M4A3E2, otherwise called the Jumbo. The Jumbo features significantly heavier upper front plate armor, turret side armor, and side armor. These are actually fairly difficult to penetrate with a Tiger. While there are some parts of the turret around the neck or forehead that you can sometimes pen, it's a little inconsistent, and the machine gun port on the left hand side of the hull is usually going to be your best shot in taking them out. Additionally, the lower side of the Jumbo is actually incredibly weak, so if it does angle a little too much, simply shooting behind the tracks can also often result in a kill. These are generally going to be the places you're going to want to shoot a Jumbo. In terms of firepower, the Jumbos can either have the short 75 or 76. In this respect, they present the same problem as the basic Sherman in that they can snap shots to your weak points very quickly, and even a 75 Jumbo can very rapidly take out your cupola, knock out your whole turret crew, hit your gun, and then you're basically dead in the water waiting for it to kill you. And of course, the next common vehicle you're going to see are the American tank destroyers, the M36 Jackson and the M18 Hellcat. The M18 Hellcat is noticeably faster than the Jackson, but it does have a noticeably weaker gun, only supporting the 76mm, whereas the Jackson actually has the 90mm. The American 90mm can reliably pen a Tiger even if angled at most ranges, so it is actually a pretty significant threat. However, both the Jackson and the Hellcat are open-topped, so as I mentioned in the high explosive segment of this video, if you know one is prowling around, you probably want to go ahead and preload high explosive rounds. That way you can actually take them out just by hitting the corner of their tank, which will make your life a lot easier than having to contest them more directly. That being said, if you do have a PZGR round loaded, a hit to the middle of the Jackson will usually take it out, but the Hellcat's armor is so thin that sometimes it won't fuse these rounds correctly, and that's why I do prefer high explosive if you get the opportunity to load it. Of course, this pack does prominently feature a third vehicle, the Ostwind Ost, which is a Ostwind 2 from the Eastern Front, so we'll briefly go into that as well. In terms of mobility, the Ostwind isn't exactly a speed demon. While it is noticeably lighter than the Tigers, it does also have a lot less horsepower than the Tigers, and has very similar maximum speeds forward and reverse, so I wouldn't be expecting a whole lot in terms of automotive performance on this vehicle that will dramatically outperform the Tigers. That being said, I wouldn't characterize its mobility as unusable by any stretch of the imagination, but if you thought the Tigers were kind of sluggish, this isn't really going to change your mind. As far as armor, the Ostwind 2 is essentially useless in this area. While the hull itself does have some armor, the turret is essentially paper thin and from certain angles can even be 50 cal, so it's not exactly going to be the most robust vehicle when taking direct enemy fire. The only time you'll sometimes survive is if enemies hit the hull and leave your turret crew intact, which occasionally happens but not often enough to really count on it. There's basically no way to really use this armor or reliably bait shots, and a lot of its ability to survive is simply going to revolve around not getting hit in the first place. Additionally, as we already pointed out, if the enemy is using any kind of heat or high explosive round because you're open top, you will be killed very easily by it, and this includes things like aircraft bombs or rockets. And to top it off, while you do technically have 5 crew members, 3 of them are sitting in a very exposed turret that can simply be strafed out by things like heavy machine guns. So the durability of this is so poor that this is one of the vehicles I do generally take full ammo on, because it doesn't really change your survivability. If you're already made of glass, adding even more glass is not really hurting you. As far as the guns, you do have 2 37mm cannons. Obviously this is an anti-aircraft vehicle, so you have really good traverse and elevation speed, at least relative to other vehicles of your battle rating. These 2 37s also fire reasonably fast, and they do have a wide variety of ammo available to them. However, despite having a wide variety of ammo available to them, there's only really one round that I commonly use. Generally speaking, if you're shooting at a plane, you want the plane to essentially drop out of the sky as soon as you hit it. Damaging the plane so that it will die in 30 seconds or a minute doesn't really help you if the plane is bearing down on you, is going to annihilate you. So in this regard, the fragmentation and incendiary shells, in my opinion, simply aren't worth it. In that respect, I like to run the PZGR rounds that have around 49mm of penetration, not just because you can hunt ground vehicles with them to an extent, but also because if you hit things like wings or tails or the pilot, you can knock off whole chunks of the plane and reduce its ability to fly at all. Additionally, while 49mm may not seem like that much to engage ground targets, and indeed in most cases isn't really that impressive, you can aim for things like cupolas or lower sides, or even find weaker vehicles like M18s, M36s, or PT-76s running around, and this shell will absolutely shred them to pieces because you have a pretty good rate of fire. So if you do stumble across some of these lightly armored vehicles, or you know somebody is flanking your team with them, the Ostwind 2 can actually tear them apart pretty efficiently from most distances. Of course, as far as tactics on an anti-air, there isn't that much to it. The big piece of advice I would give any anti-air player is, if the map allows for it, you generally want to move outside of your spawn, because that's the first place aircraft will come looking for anti-air. Additionally, if you find you're not hitting a plane with these guns, you should probably aim ahead of them by another 50% or so, because usually players tend to not lead the plane far enough rather than lead it too much. As far as hunting ground vehicles, it's hard to give advice about how to consistently do it with the Ostwind 2, because you have essentially no armor and your penetration does limit the types of vehicles you can engage effectively, and this means that if this is your last spawn and you're trying to hunt some ground kills, you should definitely avoid any avenue of approach that means you're going to be running head first into enemies, because more likely than not this will result in you getting killed. You either want to look for good flank routes where you can get side shots on enemies, or simply hang next to teammates and try to support them in their efforts by knocking off tracks and barrels. Also, as one additional minor detail, the camouflage netting for both the Ostwind Ost and the Tiger West are removable. If you go into the modifications, you can deselect the camouflage netting and this will remove it from the vehicle. And on the Tiger West, interestingly enough, there actually is still a mesh screen that holds the camouflage netting in place, which is kind of interesting, but it doesn't really do anything in game. On the whole, deleting this camouflage netting doesn't really do anything, so you might as well keep it on. To wrap up my thoughts on the Two Fronts pack, if somebody were to ask me is it a good deal, my general answer is yes. Getting 3 premium vehicles at rank 3 for $35 on top of the Golden Eagles and the premium time is a fairly good deal, considering the average rate for a premium vehicle is the rank times $10, so a rank 6 premium is usually around $60 and a rank 3 is usually $30 on its own. On top of that, if you look at the Tigris, the Italian Tiger, that vehicle is 4,880 Golden Eagles, which is the equivalent to about $25 just for one Tiger, and in this pack you're getting 2 Tigers, an Ostwind, and some Golden Eagles and some premium time, so even on sale at half off, the Tigris is actually a worse deal than this pack. So on the whole, as far as what you're getting for your money, this is a pretty good deal. As far as a starter pack, I actually think this is a pretty good deal as well, because in my experience, the big thing that new players struggle with in War Thunder is understanding how the damage model works. So the most important thing for a starter vehicle is having a gun that will generally penetrate most targets, and that will also generally kill a target if the shell gets in the crew compartment, which the long 88 facilitates, on top of the fact that the Tiger's armor is actually pretty usable, and will sometimes save you even if you're not paying attention. And to boot, the Tigers actually scale incredibly well with player skill. While a relatively inexperienced player can drive around the map clicking on things with red name tags and at least get some successes with that, as you get better at the game, you get better at angling, you understand vehicles more, you understand how to use the gun more, you will experience better and better results because the Tiger does just scale well like that. Of course, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe. That always helps out the channel. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.